I will speak about is the bad guy a cultural thing, personal preferences, and cultural factors, and also on behavioral intention. Um, Going to the next slide, I will first of all give you an idea of the motivation for this research. For sure, it's part of my PhD thesis that I'm working on. Why this study? Basically, the relevance, both from a perspective of academic relevance and business relevance. Um, I will be sharing with you the study goals and the research questions that I have addressed specifically within the thesis, but more specifically within this pilot study, the methodology used, and then the results and future research, and then some Q&A. Hopefully, you will have some questions for me, and I hope some critical questions, because that is all what it's all about. So let's go for the motivation for research. As a matter of fact, when you talk about culture, and in this case, I'm talking about national culture, organizational culture, and professional culture, all these different cultures can be seen as factors of influence, both on individual behavior, but they can also be an explanation for the behavior within these different cultural contexts. Um, these different cultural levels, so to speak, can also be direct influences of employee behaviors, and employees can also influence these different levels of culture. As you see in the text, and I will not read it up, but what it comes down to, and that's an explanation for is the bad guy a cultural thing? Um, all these potential cross-cultural misunderstandings can basically result into things that you do not want in an organization. Increase absenteeism, staff turnover, accidents, etc., etc. The key point here is if we understand the explicit and implicit cultural factors that are influencing a person's perception and perspective, it can be the case that culture can have a positive effect and enhance productivity, satisfaction, and motivation of employees. So again, I'm not too sure if culture is really the bad guy. So that's the key question. So why the study? Because there is so much published on culture. We know all these big studies about national culture. But there are few studies that have looked at how people and their adaptive behavioral patterns, how they are within different ecological settings. The other thing is that there are only a few studies that really looked at the influence of culture on personal preferences. And please allow me to go to the definitions on the cultural levels and personal preference in a later stage, after I've explained the relevance of this study. But again, the majority of studies have focused on cultural influence at a single level. So they have either looked at national cultural influence on employee behavior or organizational behavior, or they have looked at organizational culture. So not at all the levels of cultures altogether. The other research study is a business relevance. We know that globalization had led to an increase of cross-cultural contacts. Multinational companies have affiliates and offices across the globe. There is intensive communication on a daily, on an hourly basis, and companies are really sometimes struggling, but they are looking for strategies how to best manage these cross-cultural teams or cross-functional teams, and how to improve cross-cultural interpersonal communication. So how do you deal from an Asian perspective with the Europeans? How do you deal from a European perspective with the Americans, the Africans, and the other way around? You see, I'm talking about generalizations here. from a national cultural perspective. The point is how to prevent these miscommunications or distorted perceptions and ultimately distrust, because that is what it ultimately leads to. Before I go to the next slide, let me first give you a definition on what I mean with national culture. And again, these are not my definitions, but these are definitions that can be found in the very large amount of publications, either within cross-cultural psychology, management sciences, sociology, etc., etc. This definition from national culture is from Hofstede, and he basically says that national culture is the collective programming of the mind which distinguishes the member of one group or category of people from another. He suggests, so Hofstede, that several layers of culture, national, professional, and organizational programming, all have an influence on a person's individual behavior. Another definition that I've used is in regards to organizational culture. The definition is from Ulijn, Nagel, and Tan. I will not bother you with the reference, but it's a definition that is widely used. Organizational culture is seen as the norms and the values that are anchored in the organization and refers to the shared values, attitudes, standards, and beliefs that characterize members of an organization and define its nature. And last but not the least, from a cultural factor perspective, the professional culture defined as to professionals that can be classified as a group of practitioners, researchers, teachers who have a common base of knowledge, a common jargon, similar background and training, and a sense of identifying with each other. You still have one definition that I need to explain, and that's the definition for personal preferences, because I am looking at the influence of these factors, both personal preferences and cultural factors, on employee behavior, and more specifically, behavioral intention. So personal preferences, I define, if I've used the definition, as personal preference, one way how a person prefers to present him or herself within a cultural context. Personal preferences are an integral part of our thinking and behavior. So now you're up to speed in regards to the definitions used. Probably will provide a better understanding moving forward. So what were my study goals and the research questions? As mentioned, I want to study the influence of people's personal preferences and cultural factors on their behavioral intention, so how they perceive, how they would behave. My research questions are, first of all, can you theoretically distinguish the influence of the personal preference and cultural factors? It has not been done because it has always been taken into account that culture and personal preference are indistinguishable. The other question is there a difference in influence between these two factors, personal preference, and if you can theoretically distinguish them, on behavioral intention? So what did I do? First of all, I did a literature study to discover that indeed you can distinguish the different cultural levels from personal preference from a perspective of their influence on behavioral intention. I will not bother you with the theory, but the theory and the framework derives from basically two mainstreams. One is the concept of Fishbein and Eisen of planned behavior, and the other one is from Portega that talks about that both your genetics, your genetic blueprint, and your environment influence your behavior. That sounds familiar, I would say. But again, what you see here is the research framework and what I intend to study. And what I will present is the yellow part, the influence on behavioral intention. And behavioral intention defined as thinking and behavioral, thinking preference and behavioral attributes. So you probably already know the direction I'm going. So what I basically did is, after my pilot study, I have looked at different models in the literature, how culture, the different levels of culture, influence values, practices, individual behavior, or individual culture. From that literature study or model study, I basically came to two propositions. One is that personal preferences influence behavioral intention more than by organizational culture, professional culture, and national culture. And professional culture has more influence on behavioral intention than organizational and national culture. As you can understand, after I have these propositions, I needed to go and find a way how to measure this, what I wanted to measure. So what I basically did, I've used the Emergenetics instrument, the Emergenetics questionnaire, because, as you all know, the Emergenetics questionnaire is as valid and as reliable as the golden standard. You know from our technical report that it was compared to the golden standard, the Big Five, and it can basically stand out. On the other hand, we have proved that the Emergenetic instrument can be used within different cultural contexts. So that was another reason to use the Emergenetics instrument in my study. Let me look at the time. Okay. So basically, I had a convenience sample of 524 professionals that I've collected over the last 3 years, and they all went to the Emergenetics 100 questions, and you know what, the Likert scale 1 to 7. And basically, they also went to a second questionnaire, and that was also based on the Emergenetics questionnaire. So all their answers they have given to the 100 questions, I have put into an Excel format. So if it would say, I am musical, and they have scored a 6, they would see a 6 there in the rank. And they the question was, how is this 6 influenced by your national, your organizational, your professional, or your personal preference? So the score on your thinking and behavioral preferences, how is it influenced by culture or personal preferences? And they needed to score on the Likert scale of 1 to 4, 1 being the most like me, 4 being the least influence. So 1 the most influence, 4 the least influence. I basically divided my sample into 3 categories. I've looked at professions, so management, marketing, finance, engineers, and others, and then made a difference between males and females, and in regions, Europe, Americas, Africa, and Asia. And I had 21 different nationalities included in the sample. So the table you see below the slide is the first phase. That was the first questionnaire. So I got the response of 73%, 383. And then you see the split in males, Europeans, non-Europeans, and then professions. And then in the second phase, so the second questionnaire, I got a lower response of 27%, but you see the split in regards to gender, region, and profession. So these are the results of my study. Basically, what you see is on the left-hand side, you see gender, males, females, the split, the amount, the region, European, non-Europeans, and then the 3 categories, management, professionals, and academia. Then you see the influence of the national culture, organizational and professional culture, and personal preferences in the 4 columns, as well as the standard deviation. So, as I already told you, if you scored a 1, most influence, and a 4 for least influence, it would mean that the lower the mean score, the higher the influence. So let's take a look at the gender group. And what you see there is, so if we go here, you see that the mean score for males is 50.6, and it goes up 61.9, 65.7, 72.2. So it means that the least influence on is national culture. The most influence is personal preferences. So I have made a statistical analysis for each of these categories. And here is what you see, the overall group. And what it tells you is that within the overall group, personal preferences has the most influence. And that goes then for professional culture, organizational culture, and national culture, the least influence on behavioral intention. And with the standard deviations, you see that at each of the columns. I hope you're still with me. What I also did is basically look at the correlations. And there are some interesting things here. Basically, on this side, the paired correlation, you see in this column, you see the national culture, how it correlates with organizational, professional culture, and personal preferences. And here you see organizational culture, how it correlates with professional culture, personal preferences, and professional culture, how it correlates with personal preferences. So there are some interesting findings here. One thing that comes to directly visible is that there is a negative correlation between national culture and professional culture, and national culture and personal preferences. That means if you talk about the negative correlation, that if the influence of national culture goes up, the influence of professional culture goes down. And that is also applies also for national culture and personal preferences. The same accounts basically for organizational culture and professional culture, and organizational culture and personal preferences. So what we see here is that both national culture and organizational culture are negatively correlated with professional culture, and personal preferences. And if we take both national culture and organizational culture, we see a positive correlation, and that shouldn't be a surprise. Interesting to see that there is also a positive correlation between personal preferences and professional culture. I will go into much detail in regards to conclusions in the later stage. So, conclusions. Indeed, what we have seen is that personal preferences have more influence on behavioral intention than all the levels of culture. That professional culture has more influence than organization and national culture. And that is confirmed for all overall and all for sub-data sets. What we also see is that, and this is what I've already mentioned, and again, the interesting part is here that national and organizational culture, the positive correlation is in line with findings in the literature. Specifically, when you look at in an Asian context, research that has been done in specifically Asian companies, national culture and organizational culture are most of the time similar. On the other end of the scale, if you look at American companies, national culture and organizational culture are most of the time dissimilar. In Europe, it varies. So that's an interesting finding. The other I've already mentioned is the negative correlations, but again, that's also that can be explained because professional culture and personal preferences when you talk about professional culture, it's where you were educated. It's about your university. It's something very personal. So it's not a surprise that both professional culture and personal preferences are negatively correlated with national culture. And this here I've already explained. So again, this was a pilot study, and for sure you cannot generalize and draw big conclusions from a pilot study. So this study has its limitations. First of all, using Emergenetics is a self-reported survey, and we know that a personal bias and all of other things can give how do you call, people want to give a better perception of themselves. But again, we know that the Emergenetics instrument is valid and reliable. However, it is a self-reported survey, so that should be taken into consideration. So maybe in another study, I need to look at the mutual perception. So not only ask a person their own perception, but also how a person from another culture looks at that same person. It was a relatively small sample size, as you can imagine, especially the second questionnaire in regards to cultural influence. The second questionnaire was forced ranked because I wanted people to make a choice, and that could have caused the fact that the response rate was relatively low because people had to think very hard on what influenced their answer on the questions from the Emergenetics questionnaire. And another limitation can be the complexity. They had to score 400 items, which can be very hard to do. And also, it's quite complex if you have 400 items that you need to score. So for future research, I would focus on to look at, people can say how they will behave, but how will they actually behave? So I'm looking at not only asking people to go to the Emergenetics questionnaire and the cultural influence questionnaire, but to really look at a real life case study and observe them, how they actually behave. The other thing is, the secondary questions are, how efficient is individual communication within that project team that I observe, and how is the communication between functions and cultures? And so I would have their perception on how they believe they are influenced. I would have my observations, and I would have the results from the questionnaire. The other question could be as well, what is the impact on team performance? So there is a lot to do. These are just preliminary results, but they are interested to go to the next step. I thank you very much for your attention. I see a question there. Have you studied the expatriate community? Oh, 1 second. How do you plan to take your pilot study and further develop it for future learnings? Again, as I mentioned, I now have these results. I'm still including people into the cohort. So I'm now at about 143 people for the second questionnaire. But I hope to be able to say more after I've done the case study that I'm currently working on. I will be observing 5 project teams in an European Asian context. So I hope to see how that, within a real life business case, how that works out. And then to be able to say more. Yeah, I have a question. Have you studied an expatriate community in this interaction? People who were raised in one culture but mostly live in another work. No, I have not specifically asked people whether they are expatriate or not. However, I I have at least 10% of people that were students that were studying in Holland for a long time, more than 4 years. And so that might have influenced their perception. I don't know. If I'm not wrong, Emma seems to be slightly more influenced by OC rather than PF. Is this correct? Do you have an explanation? You're absolutely right. I have 5 of the academics that basically mentioned that they were more influenced by their organizational culture rather than by their personal preferences. I do not have an explanation for that. I think it's quite a small group of 5, mainly professors and PhD researchers from the university. And probably I need to have more responders to be able to give a good answer to that. So more or less depending on an asset, does it sync with your finding? I have a question here. It's value. My anecdotal experience find that the person will manifest itself more or less depending on national culture. Does it sync with your findings? It seems like there is, if national culture influence goes up, personal preference or professional culture goes down in influence. So there is more a connection between professional culture and personal preferences rather than national and organizational culture with personal preferences. If I want to make a bold statement, it would mean that it would rather to spend time on professional culture and personal preferences in regards to change in organizations and in regards to communication in organizations. Thank you very much for your questions. We have to go. We have to move to the next speaker. It was a privilege and an honor to present to you. I have a long way to go. I'm really thankful for Emergenetics to have given me the opportunity to do the research in this way, and I hope to contribute in the future for us to have a better understanding of the influence of culture and personal preferences. Because if we understand the perspective and the perceptions of people better, we can have better cross-cultural communication and therefore more effective communication and more efficient organization. Thank you again. Thank you very much.